Welcome to this week's episode of the Scottish Property Podcast. My name is Stephen Clark, and I'm joined as always with my co-host Nick Ponte. How are you, Nick?
I'm all good, mate. Yeah, good chat this week with our guest.
Yeah, mate. So I invited I invited one of the guys from my mastermind group onto the podcast, Gavin Burnett, particularly because I thought it was such an interesting story. Like Gav's picked up his first buy to let, and the minute he opened the door with the keys, it's meant to be this nice, fantastic. Let's post fucking some nice picture on Instagram story. It turned to shit. The flat was riddled with damp, with dry rot, wet rot, a roof repair, and the person that sold it to him knew about it, and his neighbour let him know the minute that he opened the door. There's a letter waiting for him. So I was kind of keen to get someone on, because we do try and share the doom and gloom of it, and not just the positive stories. We want to try and share the reality of property investing. So I asked Gav to come on, and he really, he's a nice guy. He takes action, like he just gets stuck in about it. Yeah. But he felt like an imposter syndrome of coming on the podcast. Like, no, I've listened to podcasts for a couple of years. I'm not coming on it. I'm just starting. I'm like, but this story is so valuable to people that are starting out. It can show you the stumbling blocks that you can actually come across, but also how you mitigate these risks, how you problem solve, and how you come out the back end of it, don't you?
This is why I find this sort of content so valuable, because this is like stories from people who are in it and experiencing it now. So there is so much that we can learn. I mean, like, I have never come across like a serious case of dry rot. So I was like really listening and taking it all in, and I've learned quite a lot from hearing it. And Gav was so open and honest about, his story, and there was a real interesting kind of twist to it with the guy that basically, the seller that basically screwed him over at the start. So listen out for that as well, because there is a positive outcome to it all. And I think he's done phenomenally well to get this project on track. And just obviously there is so many pitfalls in property, and these are the types of things that we need to look out for. So without further ado, we'll just cut to the interview with Gav Burnett.
So welcome to the Scottish Property Podcast, Gav Burnett. Thanks very much for joining us, mate.
No problem at all. Good to be here.
So Gav's got serious imposter syndrome by being on this podcast, but we think he's got a hugely important story to tell us, because right now, Gav's, I'll let you tell your story. You're in your first project and shit's went wrong.
Wait a minute, we've been doing this podcast 3 years and we still feel like imposters, Gav, so don't worry about it. Honestly, mate, we're all learning. Every single day is a learning day, so it'd be great to hear your story.
Absolutely. Yeah, mate, take us back to the start. Go for it. How, what's your background, and what made you kind of get started in property, and what was the journey to this, picking up the keys for this project?
Yeah, well, I guess background goes a long way back. I grew up on a farm. I've always liked building stuff. I've always done stuff with my hands. Then bought my first home back in 2014. We renovated that ourselves, basically took that back to brickwork and did everything ourselves. We then moved down to Glasgow, did the same thing in Glasgow. Had quite a lot of fun doing that. I actually took Martin Roberts' one-day property seminar at that point. Was quite keen to get started, but never really had the balls to do anything more, and realised that the course was basically just an upsell to try and get you to do the more expensive course. But yeah, so we renovated the Glasgow one. We made a bit of profit on it when we eventually sold it. And I came back to Aberdeen, and then I got a bit of a scare about a year ago. I mean, I'm in the oil industry, and we went through kind of a small downturn, and all of a sudden the kind of penny just clicked. That I thought, like, if I lose my job, it puts us in, me and the partner in serious, pretty difficult financial situation, and we can't just keep going on relying on a job to support you. So another form of income makes sense. So property was the plan. At the same time, I came across an Instagram from a certain individual who was advertising the property course, selling me the dream. So I jumped on that, and next thing we know, 3 days later, I'm a graduate of the Stephen Clark property of course.
Was it his brand new Porsche that took your eye? Was it? Is that what?
No, it wasn't. Funnily enough, it wasn't the Porsche one. It was it was an advert, specifically the fact he had been offshore, and that was the dream. So
nice, mate. You took action straight away, which was brilliant, because how many days after the workshop did you get your offer accepted on your first deal? Like, you were pretty much right off the fucking starting blocks.
Yeah, so I actually made the first call to a property on the course, which was thanks for that. That was horrific. But no, I saw that property within about 2 days of the course. I went to see it and put the first offer in within the week. Left it for a few weeks because the first offer was rejected. Left it a few weeks, and then we went back again and spoke to the solicitor, and they kind of advised us to go just a little bit higher, but still a long way down. It still worked with the numbers. So within the first couple of weeks, we had the offer accepted.
Nice. So tell us a wee bit of background on the property then, to give the listeners a
bit. So like many in Aberdeen, it was a property that sat in the market for, I think, 9-10 months, something like that. Top floor flat in Rosemount. Very typical of the area. It was a one bed, but it's a big one bed, 52 square meters or something like that. So yeah, it looked good. It looked potential for a 1 to 2 bed conversion. Looked great. Apart from the interior decor, nothing looked too insurmountable. And
the plan was to add that to the portfolio. Was that
the plan was buy to let, so keep it the portfolio. It felt like it was decent stock. It's in a good area, Aberdeen. Growth in there was pretty good, and the rental income's high as well. So yeah, no, it seemed like a good one to start with.
And what was the valuation then when you looked at this property, and what did you negotiate for the purchase price? Like, just to kind of.
Home report was 80. We got it for 62. Well, we actually secured it for 65 initially, and then renegotiated it down a little bit to just over 62. When I was just at was it October last year, I think, when things started going mental. It was either the interest rates or when the rent freeze came back in. I used that to leverage a little bit back off it as well, because nothing had still been concluded. So yes, we ended up getting for just over 62. We based our numbers initially, when I'd gone in really low, I based my numbers on keeping it as a one bed, kind of going worst case scenario. And then we eventually decided that a 2 bed would be quite an easy conversion. Shouldn't be a problem to get away with it. So,
and what would that uplift the difference in the values from the 1 bed to the 2 bedroom?
I can't remember at the time, but I think we valued it at something like 90 for a 1 bed in a good condition, and then I worked with 2 bed numbers at 105. Nice. But I think realistically now, just with the way things have gone and it's dragged on, it's slowly nudging us up. I think we're probably the 110, 115 mark when we get a final valuation, which would be good.
Nice. So, do you know what? Talk us through the kind of the strategy, the raising the finance for it. Because I mean, it's probably quite a good thing to go back and talk about that from the first deal. You're like, this is why I really want to get you on, because you're in it right now, the pains right now. And so even just, what was the process up to raising the finance to actually making the purchase?
So the plan was to, like a lot of people, the plan was to get the deal and then worry about the money after that. Got the deal secured. Was pretty happy there's money to be made in it, and I could pull money back out. So from then it was, I didn't really want to be bothered with going through the banks and stuff. I wanted to try and do it all sort of private investor funded from the start, just because I know it's likely something that I'm going to have to do down the line. So figured I'd put it out to the start. So I knew some folk in a close circle that had a bit of money sitting there. So kind of approached them with numbers and I've managed to do this whole one purchase price and renovation through 3 different parties, but yeah, it's all private investor funded.
Nice.
and the next one that I've just purchased, I've managed to purchase that private investor funded as well. So,
right.
And how did how did that come about? Because like, you know, we hear a lot about people finding the private investors, but like, is that just in your, like, is it family, friends of family?
So yeah, so initially it was, my mother and father-in-law were a big chunk of it. A friend of mine who's out in Oman were on board for that. But I've put a few things up on social since then. I've been hit up by a couple of people, yes, they're in my circle, but not immediately close. It surprises you. Like, if you kind of show up and you put stuff out there, it's amazing how many people are sitting there with money and are quite keen to lend it on board. I mean, I've had a guy I used to work with, who's approached me. I've had a guy, again, another oil guy, but I think we've had maybe one conversation in our life approach me about coming on board as well. And yeah, I mean, if the bottom line is, if you can offer an interest rate that beats the bank, which is not hard to do, then people have got money and are happy to lend it to you, so long as they have, a bit of trust in you, a bit of security. It's easy enough to do, to be honest, or certainly at smaller figures anyway.
How did you feel raising this private finance for the first deal as well? Was there a bit of imposter syndrome on it, or was that just a bit like, what, the fucking numbers work? I've got it for a good price. I know where my end values are going to be. Let's go for it.
I want to be humble and say yes, but the bottom line is no. I was like, the numbers stacked up. The numbers looked good. I was happy enough. I was still buzzing of coming off the back of the course, to be honest, as well. Still have that sort of hype. But no, I was pretty confident. I mean, yourself and the mastermind group as well that had a look over the numbers, and everybody was kind of on board that my numbers made sense. So I was happy enough to take that money on. But don't get me wrong, it's still a big thought. Having got there's losing your money and then there's losing somebody else's money. It's
yeah. Nah, absolutely. So fast forward then, a few weeks later, and you get the keys.
So we get the keys, walk through the door of the flat, and as I do, there's a letter sitting waiting for me through the letterbox addressed to me personally. I open this letter up, and it is from the downstairs neighbour, who informs me that the flat is infested with dry rot. And that the seller had known about it, had failed to disclose it, and that was that. So, of course, the immediate reaction, what should have been a good day, immediately was just wiped clean, and that was it. Miserable day from there on. So the guy had been good enough. He actually works out with the country, but he'd left his phone number, so I gave him a phone. And he said, yeah, it's riddled with dry rot. The joists are all wrecked. We've got.
So he openly admitted that on the first conversation.
So this was the neighbour. Yeah. So he says, yeah. So we had suspicion of ours. We've opened it up and we've chased it up, and the roof's wrecked, or the roof of his flat. So the floor of my flat is gone. And he said, I'll send you the details of the guy who's doing the work. So of course, heart immediately sinks, and then you go to all these worst case scenarios. The stuff that you've seen online, these horror stories that buildings are virtually condemned through dry rot, and you're like, oh, great, how have I missed this? What have I missed? So, got in touch with them.
And let's face it, how could you see it?
So there was one, because the dry rot was so bad, there was actually one telltale sign that I could see in my flat. There was, this is only in hindsight, but there was a small section of skirting board kind of that went round the side of the fireplace. Now that skirting board was kind of shrunk, warped, and looked like it had a lot of like filler packed into it. Now, sure enough, that could have been just a landlord bodge job repair, but in hindsight, when we took that skirting board apart, it was basically sawdust. There was nothing left.
I'm pretty sure that when you found that out, you probably quickly became a dry rot expert through Google, did you? So, like, can you just explain to can you explain to listeners? Just obviously, can you give I know you're not an expert, but like, can you give us a brief description of what the dry rot is?
Yeah, sure. So dry rot is a fungus. It spreads through like mycelium root network. It travels through the blockwork of the building, and then it eats away. It eats the wood basically to survive, and grows and moves. The difference between it and obviously wet rot's not what you want, but you can fix that by fixing your leak and then replacing the section. Dry rot is a lot harder to get rid of because it's a living organism. It grows, it feeds, it moves. It's dangerous.
So like you say, it's a bit of a hidden nasty, because you wouldn't necessarily, people might think, oh, damp or rot, you would see it through, like, I don't know, like water coming in through the walls or the ceilings or something like that. But like you say, that can just travel through from the brickwork and all that, yeah?
Exactly, yeah. So because it's a spore, or starts off life as a spore, it travels, and typically, yeah, it needs moisture somewhere in that system to start, but once it gets going, it doesn't need to be in wet areas, and it will just travel.
And this is where I get a bit of stick as well for saying like that the home report's only really worth the paper it's written on, because you've got no comeback on that. The home reports couldn't lift the carpets, couldn't lift the floor, and they couldn't inspect it. You can really see it, and unless you're poking a screwdriver in every bit of wood to see if it, if it's soft, like you're not going to see this. You're not going to pick this up.
No, I always think it's so funny. You speak to people that buy in England and they think, oh, home report's such a great idea. Really glad it gets done. But no, in reality, it's not worth the paper it's written on. They're just nonsense.
Can you describe the moment when you realised the extent of the problem? Did you start lifting up like floorboards, or what?
Yeah,
describe, when it was exposed to you.
So the initial reaction was like, what have I done? The heart fell out of me altogether. But then when I got in touch with the dry rot guy, he took me down to the flat below to show me what was like, because by that point their ceiling and stuff was down already. So to show me the extent of it, and yeah, it was every bit as bad, if not worse, than when I first read the letter. It's just a horrible, horrible feeling when you start seeing the joists that, what are they? They're 8.5 inch, about 8.5 inch deep joists that are supporting the floor, and when you can fit your whole arm through the middle of the joist, it's not a nice feeling.
Basically, the joists are holding up the building, aren't they? They're holding up your flat.
Yeah, well, they should have been, but they definitely weren't. There was nothing left of them. The worst thing about dry rot as well, the other thing that makes it a real hidden nasty is it tends to eat it from the inside out. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it looked bad on the outside, but once you get into the joist, you realise that, I mean, it's compost. There's nothing left inside it. It's just horrible.
And this rot guy, he'd already came out to inspect your flat and knew there was an issue with it.
Yeah, so he was. He's a really interesting guy from the start, because I phoned him and he straight away, he was not happy that the seller had done what he'd done. The seller had, so the downstairs neighbour had initially carried out the dry rot inspection, and then the dry rot guy had spoken to the guy who was selling my flat, and sure enough, within a quick look at that bit of skirting board, obviously him being an expert, quick look at that skirting board, he said, yeah, you've got the dry rot up here as well. It's in the walls as well as the floor. So the seller had asked him if he would date the report after the date the missives were signed. He'd actively gone out of his way to try and hide this. Now, Scott, being the guy that he is, this did not sit well with him at all. He says, oh, not only am I not going to do that, he was gunning for the guy basically when I spoke to him. So, and then obviously the panic sets in. You're like, right, well, I found this within the first few days, so I'll speak to a litigation solicitor and see what we can do with chasing it. And I spoke to them, but the problem I had was this guy's forwarding address, the guy that sold it, his forwarding address was in Singapore. He's not even in the country. So you could spend all that money chasing a litigation solicitor and taking them through the courts, but then once you get your court order, there's not necessarily any chance that he's going to pay up, because he's not based in the country, and chasing it's just going to be a waste of time. So I thought, right, well, I'll just have to get my teeth and bear it, and work out somewhere in the renovation that I can kind of pull money back to sort of mitigate the cost, because the plan was always to give it quite a decent high spec renovation. So I thought, well, maybe you can go for some lower quality stuff and save the cost that way. And
what was your original renovation budget then?
Original renovation budget was 16,000 at that point.
So you a chunky enough budget for it, yeah.
It was a chunky budget, but that was 16 grand with me doing a lot of the work was the kind of plan at that point. Hoped I could bring it back closer to sort of 14, but 16 was kind of factored into the numbers.
And what was the conversation with the litigation lawyer, and did they give you advice on how to how to potentially recoup?
Yeah, I mean they were pretty adamant that I would have a good case, but for what could be a $3 grand, $4 grand brought bill, you could then potentially spend that in legal costs chasing that, and the fact is based in Singapore, there's no guarantee getting that money back. So do you really want to drag it out, and do you want to go through all that hassle to then potentially not get any further with your money?
So was your plan then just to go ahead with the rock guy and just get strip away repaired?
Yes, the plan was to go ahead with the rock guy, but I thought I'm gonna wing it anyway. I'm gonna send the seller an email, just tell him I've spoken to a litigation solicitor. I have the rock guy who's prepared to say that, to stand up and say that you knew about it, you asked for the report to be dated post sale. You were actively doing your bit to try and avoid paying up. And within half an hour, an email back saying, I'll pay for it.
Oh, really? Okay, oh, brilliant. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so this email come back from, but I mean, obviously saying he's going to pay for it and I'm actually paying for it are two very, very different things. But yeah, so I chanced my luck and said, I'm just going to pay for it. So,
so then what was the next process with the refurb? Then did you get crack on with the strip out straight away? And then
fired straight into strip out, got the things ripped out, got things going. Had instructed my rock guy to get on and start work for that.
What was the quote for the works? Like, what did you have to then add on to your budget? After you found that out.
Scott was he's really cheap, to be fair. It's just shy of $2 grand was what the work was. Now that work that included the rip out aspect of it, the work to be done, and the reinstatement. But I spoke to him to see if he would be interested in basically allowing me to do the rip out and the reinstatement work, and if that would bring the quote down. Yeah, he was happy enough to do that. So I ripped the stuff out, and the plan was to me to reinstate it, and then we'd still build a cellar for the.
And what did that involve then? Like looking at it from somebody who doesn't have any experience at that, do you have to prop up the actual?
Yeah, so initially that's rip a meter up the walls. You take all the plaster off and a meter up, because it can travel. You need to inspect above where you have rot. So we knew we hadn't the joist, so we're meter up, and then the floorboards come back a meter from the wall, to that point.
Which exposes the joist where obviously all the damage has been done.
Exposes the joist. Yeah, the joist, the window lintel. So all of that had to be replaced. The window lintel, the joists. They cut away the infected section. So they cut away the joists, put a new joist in, and then it runs 1.5 meters back from where you've cut the joist, and then the joist the two joists get stitched together. So it's a big process, yeah, and
quite labor intensive.
Yeah, quite labor intensive. But the plan was initially to, rather than to use acro props to hold the building up, you basically just do one joist at a time, and then the support isn't really required. But because our joists were in such a mess that we had he had done the first one. I started doing the second one. Joist 3 and joist 4 were really bad. When he started cutting into the second one, it pinched the saw blade, which means the joist was flexing, so the building was moving, because obviously it wasn't held with the next two joists. So at that point, we stopped and we went and got acros to prop it up. And to keep it all held up.
This is amazing, like, listening to this, because like I've never experienced anything like this, but when you're like, I mean, this is, for me, that's quite a big job. Now, after doing it, you'll probably cruise through the next one. If like, you identified issues like that, you're probably like, just add on a extra few grand and it'll be fine.
I mean, don't get me wrong, the heart would still sink, but yeah, it's easier. It's easier once you've done it. And like any of these things, once you have a good trade, once you know somebody that's good at it and reliable, and I would pick up his company name, but we did a few things that I'll not tarnish his reputation with it. So
no, that's all right. Plus, you said he was quite cheap, so anybody listening, if you did mention his company name, he'd be going, "Wait a minute, you did it? You did it for Gav for $2,000, so I'm expecting the same." So no, that's all right.
No, so yeah, so it was brilliant. So we got the work done, and as I say, we started doing the work, and we kind of thought it was basically the way the dry rot you normally find the dry rot. It's either at the front or back of property, or both, but rarely in the middle, because it starts at the brickwork and then goes in. So we kind of thought it was narrowed to the back quarter of the flat. But after we had ripped out that whole room, the last joist was wrecked, and sure enough, the joist in the next room was gone as well. So there was a lot more to be done than the original budget.
Was it all dry rot, or did you find anything else while you were ripping stuff up?
We had a couple of bits of wet rot in the roof truss, which is back.
Is that easier to fix?
Yes and no. Basically, the process is the same. You have to make the plate, fix your leak, and then cut out the wet rot, replace it with another bit of timber. It's more visual, like you can see it. It's less aggressive than dry rot, though, because it needs a point that the wood is physically in contact with moisture. So places you normally find out at the bottom of like lath and plaster walls, where the rubble's all built up, or where timber meets block work on roof trusses that have leaked and things like that. Just that sort of area, that's where you find it. So cut it out, you fix your leak, cut it out, stitch it back up, and that's you good. So it was easier to do. But yeah, so the rest of the dry rot, there was obviously more than we had planned. So again, chanced my luck. I got Scott to come up with another quote for the rest of the work. He inflated it a little as well, and we sent that off to the seller to see if he'd be up for paying the rest of it as well. And yes, it has taken 2 weeks, but that money is now in. Money has now been paid, so he's
result. So he did come true to his word then. So fair play to him.
Yeah, yes, he did. He held out. So in the end of the day, props off, hats off to him, sort of thing. I think reading between the lines, what had happened is he knew this dry rot was there, but didn't want the sale to fall through.
Yeah.
So was happy to pay up, but.
That's a good result. But do you think, obviously, that email with the mention of legal action, obviously that helped, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, he wouldn't have come forward and volunteered the money.
Yeah, exactly.
He volunteered it, but equally still, I think the threat of doing it was enough to put him in his place, which was good.
So bring us up to date now, where you are currently with the project.
Yeah, so we've got the plumbing roughed in, we've got the electrical roughed in, we have all our dry rot work carried out. The floors are re-insulated, the floorboards are back down. We're just at the point of putting plasterboard back on the walls now, and that should be us. So we're well underway with that one. So
it's good, mate. So it is going to have a positive ending. Let's say what would be the implications if you had to foot the bill for this repair? What would be implications on your end result? Would you have changed strategy? Would you have flipped it? Would you still kept it?
It was definitely a possibility, and it was something we looked at as well, was flipping it. It gets to the point that there's those days that you walk back in, you see that dry rot, you see the work that's needing to be done, there's an ongoing, there's a roof repair coming up as well, and you just think, do I just put this together and sell it and get it moving? But then equally you think, well, you spend this 2-3 grand getting the dry rot fixed. You spend however much you need to get the roof fixed, and then once that's done, you've got a fully renovated flat with a fixed roof and a dry rot guarantee for the next 30 years. Is there any sense in flipping it? Do you just keep it? It could have been. It certainly was an exit strategy, but it was one that we've decided against.
I mean,
Yeah, it becomes, helps the cash flow for the sort of longer term if we don't have any more, shouldn't have any more big outlays.
Tell us how the refurb figures are looking now then, because obviously, did you start off with a £16,000 budget?
Yeah. So start with 16,000. We're on track. We're on track for a 14 grand refurb, because obviously I've not had to pay any of that dry rot. However, there is this roof repair that wasn't foreseen, but we don't have quotes for it just yet. So,
how much did you get from the seller eventually?
So the seller paid. So the initial quote was just shy 1,800, I think, for the initial quote. We inflated that to 2.5 grand for the extra joists, and he paid all that. And then because I ripped everything out and plan to reinstate it, I think I pulled about just shy of £900 back out of that 2.5 grand quote. So I pulled, I'm about 900 up minus my materials and my time for redoing it. So.
Okay. So it's looking good. I mean, you're on a positive here now, so that's good. So I'm thinking to myself, what can we take from this, or what can you take from it, or share with the listeners, about potentially looking back on it again? Would there be any way of avoiding that at all? Was there anything you could have done differently? I mean, off the top of my head here, I'm thinking, imagine you'd had a chat with a neighbour before you actually offered on it.
Yeah, so totally, that's the biggest thing, Nick, and it's definitely one that I did going forward. I bought another one since starting this project, and that's one of the things I did. Is just chat the door on the neighbours, ask them. I mean, the due diligence that's done in a home report is negligible. It really, there is so little. And the property questionnaires, they're only as honest as the person that writes them. So chat the door of the neighbours. Don't be afraid to ask them. If I had gotten a hold of the downstairs neighbour when I was viewing, I would have known straight away that there was an ongoing issue. So
I guess a lot of that would just boil down to luck, because quite often you would go out, you would chat the neighbour, and they might not be in. So it just, is that going to prevent you from offering? So sometimes you just need to take a wee bit of a gamble in property, don't you?
Totally. And I mean, I think in my situation there was that bit of skirting board that, in hindsight, even if I had seen it in hindsight, knowing as little as I did, I probably would have walked past it. I would have just thought, oh, it's some cheap landlord repair. It's been slapped full of filler and had a quick coat of white eggshell to make it look good, whatever.
It's good because we learn from these experiences, don't we? Like, that's something that's never going to catch out again if there's anything that's visual.
No, you can be rest assured the skirting boards went over with a fine tooth comb in the next property, because I was adamant I wasn't gonna get stung like that again. So
what about these people that you see sometimes on viewings that go around with the wee damp meters, that poke into the walls and stuff like that? I've never actually used one myself, but would that potentially pick up on it?
I took a mate of mine. On a viewing not that long ago, and he showed up with one of these damp meters, and just went round poking random walls. He doesn't, really know what he was doing. He was, internal walls and stuff getting poked. And you're like, mate, you know,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not going to be wet there.
You
You know,
could be
trying
there,
to-
you could be there all day poking about, couldn't you? And I would
Exactly.
obviously watch out if that's obviously somebody's home and you're putting these prongs in and creating big holes in them. Well, they're not big holes, but I don't think they're going to be too happy if you leave them with loads of holes.
I mean, to be fair, the viewing we went to see it was a bomb site. The flat that we went to see, but
We touched on
yes.
this over the last few weeks, like chatting about on the weekly call. Like if if you had went in with kind of no knowledge and no kind of, I don't know, no forward planning, no trying to get it for the right price, this could have been disastrous. If you were buying this at £80,000,
Oh
with
yeah, no,
value much more. Like the fact that you've kind of negotiated it for almost £20,000 off the asking price, and then negotiated a further discount, and then obviously negotiated with the seller. This could have been a whole disastrous affair. But you adding the value through the renovation, it's still going to, and negotiating it cheaper, it's going to give you this nice big buffer that if shit goes wrong, you're still going to be safe. You're always going to get your investors' money back out this deal.
Yeah, and we're well clear of that. I mean, yes, even worst case, if I have to leave a few grand in it, the cash flow from this property, I mean, even with ridiculous mortgage rates at the moment, it's looking like cash flow and sort of nearly £300 a month. So even if we do leave a grand, 2 grand in, it's back before the end of the investor's term anyway.
Was that a worry during the process?
Initially, yes. Initially, before we had the full extent of how bad the dry rot was and what the bill was going to be to repair it, that initial thought goes through the head of, oh God, have I factored enough into this? Like, I mean, you obviously, we're sensible. We do our numbers. We buy at the right price based on what we predict the refurb cost is going to be. But there's always that risk that you're going to find some hidden nasty that's going to throw your refurb cost out the window. There is always that risk, but by buying it as low as we did, we helped mitigate and swallow any of that cost. It's kind of going to come back to, I know there's the argument that you can always buy a property with or you can buy the right property with no money down, but yeah, there's always something that could throw that off, even with the best will in the world. There's always something that can throw it off, but do what you can and build up relationships to help.
It's good, mate. I really appreciate you coming on and telling the story. What's kind of next for you then? What's the plan going forward? It's not put you off property, that's for sure.
Oh no. The plan going forward is to bite off more than I can chew and chew like fuck. Is the plan. So
chew through that dry rot.
Yeah, chew through dry rot. Yeah. So no, well, as I say, property number 2 is secured. I want to try and get a flip sorted out before the middle half of this year. And yeah, I want to get the portfolio up to 6 or 7 by the end of the year as well. So big push.
Brilliant.
It'd be good. It'd be good to be back on the podcast and share a bit more. Once you're a year or so into the journey as well, and then looking back on it, because I do appreciate that it is quite raw right now, and you're only just days out of the a positive outcome, which could have been a whole lot worse.
Yeah, no, we'll speak again in a bit of time when I've gone through another 2 houses with dry rot and
people see any of your progress online? Have you got an Instagram or any pictures that you share online where people can go and see this?
Yeah, so I've to be fair, I've been bad for not putting posts up, but it's gone up as actual stories. So yeah, Instagram's a big place for it all, and I am very honest. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. I do share the misery.
You didn't hear that from Martin. What was it, Martin Roberts? You didn't hear about the dry rot, did you?
No, I did not. No.
No, I appreciate that, mate. We'll link your page on the show notes as well, so people can look you up and follow you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks, cheers, Gav. Man. Much appreciated. Cheers.
Cheers for having me on. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
So, guys, I hope you enjoyed that real, raw, honest interview with Gav. He didn't hang about. He shared the numbers. He shared everything on the project, and obviously, how he resolved that issue and came out with what's going to look like a positive outcome.
Brilliant. As always, guys, get across to our website and book your tickets for the networking events the first Wednesday of each month, Aberdeen, Dundee, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Join the group because there's some fantastic guest speakers and everybody's out to help each other and build the growing community.
Yes, guys, and if you've taken anything from the podcast or got any value from it, please feel free to share it on social media. Tag myself and Nick in the Scottish Property Podcast, and we will reshare it to our followers. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks. See you again next week.